Hello, my name is Sarah Montgomery, and I am a psychologist with over 20 years of experience in counseling and family therapy. Before experiencing the event that changed my life, I was skeptical about religion. Although I was born and raised in a Catholic family, I had long abandoned my faith. To me, everything could be explained by science, and I believed that every problem had an answer rooted in psychology and biology. But everything changed on a fateful day, a day I will never forget. I was living a life that many would consider successful. I had a stable career, a loving family, and a life that lacked nothing. However, I felt empty. My work brought me close to those who were suffering, patients with depression, people dealing with loss, and couples in broken relationships. Gradually, I lost faith in love, kindness, and in a benevolent creator. I had witnessed too much suffering. I worked with cancer patients, people who only had months to live. I counseled abused children, grieving mothers, and individuals so desperate that they wanted to end their lives. These stories haunted me, followed me even in my sleep. I started to question, if God really exists, why does he allow such things to happen? Gradually, I became an atheist. I stopped praying, stopped going to church, and stopped believing in anything that couldn't be scientifically proven. That day was a Saturday, just like any other. I woke up early and went to the gym as usual. I was committed to my workout routine, and that day, I decided to try a new exercise, a chest press with heavier weights than usual. I thought my body was strong enough to handle it, but I was wrong. As I lifted the barbell for the second time, a sudden sharp pain shot through the back of my neck as if someone had stabbed me with a knife. I felt dizzy, lost control, and collapsed onto the floor. Everything around me started to blur. My mind was spinning, my limbs trembled, and then I lost all control over my body. Someone screamed for help. I could hear hurried footsteps, murmuring voices, but the sounds felt distant, as if I were sinking into another world. After that, I remembered nothing. The next thing I knew, I was floating in the air. I looked down and saw my body lying on the gym floor, surrounded by people trying to help. But the most terrifying thing wasn't seeing my own body. It was the overwhelming sensation of weightlessness and freedom, a feeling unlike anything I had ever experienced before. Then, I saw a brilliant light appear in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just a ceiling light, but it was unlike any light I had ever seen. It was transparent yet radiant, warm but not blinding, and then I was pulled into it, unable to resist. I moved through a long tunnel, a seemingly endless space, and when I emerged on the other side, I found myself standing in a completely different place. All around me was a vast field, filled with colors more vivid than anything on earth. The grass was a deep, luminous green, not like ordinary grass, but as if it were made of pure light. The air was so fresh that I felt like I had never truly breathed before. And then I felt a presence, a love so immense that it enveloped me, a peace beyond imagination. I turned around and saw a man in a white robe standing before me. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were filled with kindness and love. I knew instantly it was God. I burst into tears. All the doubt, all the pain I had carried inside me for so many years melted away in that moment. God placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "You cannot stay here yet. It is not your time." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "Please don't send me back. I don't want to return to that world." He looked at me with gentle eyes and asked, Have you ever loved anyone the way I love you? I froze. I had loved my husband, my children, my friends. I had helped my patients, but I knew the answer was no. I had never loved anyone the way God loved me, an unconditional love, without selfishness, without expecting anything in return. He smiled and spoke words I will never forget. Go back and love more. Give as I have given to you. I felt a force pulling me, and then I was dragged back. When I opened my eyes, I found myself lying in a hospital bed with my husband holding my hand tightly, tears streaming down his face. I had survived, but I was no longer the same person. From that day on, I changed completely. I was no longer just a psychologist. I became a person on a mission to love. I stopped judging others, stopped worrying about insignificant things. I began to pray every day, to read the Bible, and to help others without expecting anything in return. And most importantly, I learned to love the way God had taught me. I don't know if you believe my story, but I know one thing for certain: God exists. He loves us unconditionally, and He is always waiting for us to return to Him. The transformation after returning. Since waking up after surgery, I felt like a completely different person. In the early days, I couldn't stop thinking about my experience. I hesitated to tell anyone right away, fearing they would think I had been affected by anesthesia or neurological damage from the brain hemorrhage. But I knew for certain that what I had experienced was real. My husband, Mark, was the first to notice the change. "Sarah, you're different," he said, looking at me with concern. "You're not scared about your condition anymore. You're not anxious or frustrated like before. You're strangely calm." I simply smiled. I met God, Mark. He told me to come back and love more. I thought he would laugh, but instead, his eyes welled up with tears. "I believe you," he whispered. However, the hardest part was facing myself. Before this event, I was a skeptic, living with a logical mindset and relying only on scientific evidence. But now, I knew there was a greater reality beyond human comprehension. After recovering, I returned to work, but I was no longer the same therapist. Before, I maintained a professional distance from my patients, treating them as people who needed help, but never allowing their pain to affect me too deeply. But now, I felt a profound connection with them, a level of empathy I had never experienced before. I remember a patient named Lisa, a young woman suffering from severe depression after losing her son in a car accident. Before, I would have given her rational advice and psychological coping mechanisms. But this time, I listened with my heart, and I told her about God's love. "There is a place where your son is being loved more than you can possibly imagine," I said, "and He wants you to feel that love too." Lisa looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "Do you really believe that?" I took her hand. "I don't just believe it. I've felt it. Not everyone was ready to hear my story, but those who opened their hearts could feel the transformation." One day, while at church, a place I hadn't set foot in for over 10 years, an elderly woman approached me. She stared at me for a moment and then smiled. "You've come back," she said. I was startled. "Excuse me?" She pointed toward the statue of Jesus. "He has called you back, hasn't he?" I was speechless, overwhelmed with emotion. She gently took my hands and said, "Remember this. Those who have seen God's light have a mission. You have been chosen to spread His love." I left the church that day with a sense of purpose. I realized that my experience wasn't just meant to change me. It was meant to change those around me. I began dedicating more time to those who were suffering. I joined spiritual support groups for people experiencing loss. I volunteered to help the homeless. I was no longer just a therapist. I was truly living with the purpose God had given me. And most importantly, I loved more. I learned to forgive, even those who had hurt me. I no longer saw life in black and white. I understood that we are all on our own journeys, and what matters most is that we love one another as God loves us. If there is one thing I want to share after everything I have been through, it is this: God is real. He loves us unconditionally, without judgment, without expecting anything in return, except that we learn to love one another. We don't have to wait until we are near death to realize this truth. Love now. Forgive. Help others. Look at life with compassion, because one day we will all return to His light. And when that day comes, the only thing that will matter is not what we have owned or achieved, but how we have loved. Love one another as I have loved you.